I watched the same woman do two completely opposite things on the same day, and I need you to understand exactly what that means, not just for Venezuela, but for every person who still believes that what is happening in Caracas right now has anything to do with democracy, sovereignty, or the dignity of the Venezuelan people. March 21st, 2026, Caracas. The World Baseball Classic trophy arrived in the capital today. Venezuela beat the United States 3-2 in the final. The streets were already electric from the victory, and Delcy Rodríguez, the woman who has positioned herself as the caretaker president of a nation in transition, walked out in front of the cameras in front of thousands of people waving Venezuelan flags and held that trophy above her head like a conqueror returning from war. The crowd roared. The images were stunning. And then she stepped to the microphone. What came out of her mouth was not a victory speech. It was a declaration of war against Washington, direct, aggressive, unapologetic. She looked into the cameras and told the world that the United States must immediately and unconditionally lift every single sanction against Venezuela. No conditions, no negotiations, no compromises. She said, and I am being precise here, that the Venezuelan people do not kneel, that Venezuela will not bow to imperial pressure, that her government stands as a wall against American dominance in Latin America. The crowd exploded. The base loved it. The radical Chavista cadres who have been watching this transition with deep suspicion finally had what they needed. Their leader, on camera, defying Washington with the baseball trophy still warm in her hands. It was a perfect political performance, emotionally calibrated, rhetorically precise, timed to the exact moment of maximum national euphoria, and it was a complete lie. Because here is what was happening on that exact same day, in those exact same hours, behind the doors of Miraflores Palace and the private meeting rooms of Caracas's most secured hotels. Senior officials from Delcy Rodríguez's government were sitting across the table from members of the United States Senate Foreign Relations Committee. They were also meeting with the executive leadership of Chevron, Eni, and Repsol, three of the largest Western energy corporations on the planet, and the subject of those conversations was not sanctions resistance, it was not anti-imperialism, it was not sovereignty, it was oil, and the terms under which Venezuela's oil would now flow directly into American and Western hands. The U.S. Treasury Department, specifically OFAC, the Office of Foreign Assets Control, had already issued its ruling, a sweeping general license authorizing broad transactions with PDVSA, Venezuela's state oil company. The license was not a minor adjustment or a technical carve-out. It was a fundamental restructuring of the relationship between American capital and Venezuelan resources. And embedded in that license was a provision that I want you to read carefully, because it tells you everything about what this arrangement actually is. Transactions involving China are prohibited. Transactions involving Russia are prohibited. The license explicitly and by design cuts Venezuela's two most important strategic partners out of the country's energy economy and opens that space exclusively to American and Western corporations. Let me translate that into plain language. Venezuela just agreed, in writing, through its senior officials, on the same day its president was screaming about American imperialism into a microphone, to hand effective operational control of the largest proven oil reserves on the planet to the companies and interests of the country it was publicly denouncing as the enemy. This is not a coincidence. This is not irony. This is the strategy. Chavismo 3.0 has one fundamental problem that no amount of oil money can solve on its own: legitimacy. Delcy Rodríguez was not elected. The transitional government she leads has no democratic mandate. The Maduro era destroyed the institutional credibility of every Venezuelan state organ: the courts, the Electoral Commission, the military, the civil service. What remains is a power structure that controls resources but cannot claim the consent of the governed, and within that structure, the most dangerous constituency is not the opposition. The opposition is fragmented, partially exiled, and operating under constant surveillance. The most dangerous constituency is the Chavista base itself, the millions of Venezuelans who were raised on 25 years of anti-American ideology, who genuinely believed that Chavez and then Maduro represented a sovereign alternative to Washington's dominance in Latin America. These people did not sign up for a government that sells oil to Chevron, they signed up for a revolution. If they discover, clearly, undeniably, without the fog of distraction, that their government is doing business with the corporations and the political system they were taught to despise, the reaction could be explosive, not from the opposition, from within the movement itself. Army officers who joined because they believed in the Bolivarian project, local party leaders who built careers on anti-imperialist rhetoric, community organizers who spent decades telling their neighbors that Washington was the enemy. Delcy Rodríguez understands this perfectly, which is why the baseball trophy was not a celebration. It was a management tool. The trophy gave her a window, a day, maybe two, where the entire emotional bandwidth of the Venezuelan population was consumed by something that felt like genuine national pride, a real victory. A moment where Venezuela, on a world stage, beat the Americans at their own game. The symbolism was almost too perfect to be accidental, and into that window, into that brief suspension of critical attention, she dropped three separate political realities that would have generated enormous pushback on any other day. The oil license was signed, the Western executives were received, the Russian and Chinese military and economic network, which Padrino Lopez and his generation had spent years protecting, was effectively terminated by excluding their countries from the new energy framework, and then she walked out with the trophy and called Washington the enemy. I have covered authoritarian politics for long enough to recognize a managed contradiction when I see one. What Rodríguez executed on March 21st is a technique that political scientists call controlled opposition signaling. You maintain the language and imagery of resistance, the defiant speech, the raised fist, the nationalist symbols, while simultaneously delivering the material concessions that your actual partners require. The performance is for the domestic base. The deal is for the people in the room that the cameras never enter. This works because most people, and I do not say this with contempt, I say it with the clarity of someone who has watched this pattern repeat across multiple regimes, consume politics through symbols and emotional signals rather than through the detailed mechanics of licensing agreements and corporate access frameworks. When Delcy Rodríguez says Venezuela does not kneel, the base hears defiance. They do not simultaneously cross-reference OFAC's Federal Register entry from the same morning to verify whether the policy matches the rhetoric. Washington understands this too, and Washington finds it extremely convenient. Because the United States government does not actually need Delcy Rodríguez to love America. It does not need her to give pro-Washington speeches. It does not need Venezuela to hold elections next month or release every political prisoner by Friday. What Washington needs, what the Iran war and the Hormuz crisis have made urgently necessary, is Venezuelan crude flowing reliably into supply chains that American and Western companies control. Everything else is secondary. The anti-American speech is secondary. The trophy ceremony is secondary. Even the political prisoners, the democratic timeline, the human rights commitments, secondary. The oil is primary. This is the deal. Rodríguez gets to stay in power, maintain domestic credibility through nationalist theater, and access the revenue stream that keeps her government functional. Washington gets the oil, gets Russia and China locked out of the Western Hemisphere's largest reserve, and gets a cooperative counterpart in Caracas who can be managed through economic incentives rather than confronted through military pressure. Both sides get what they actually need. Both sides perform their public role for their respective domestic audiences. And the Venezuelan people, the ones in the streets with the flags, the ones who genuinely felt pride when that trophy landed in Caracas, get to be the extras in a production whose script they were never shown. There is one more layer to this that deserves direct examination because it involves not just Rodríguez and Washington, but the broader architecture of how powerful states manufacture consent for arrangements that would otherwise be politically impossible. The exclusion of China and Russia from the new Venezuelan energy framework is not a side detail. It is the geopolitical core of the entire operation. For years, through the toughest sanction periods, through the economic devastation that drove 8 million Venezuelans into exile, it was Chinese credit lines and Russian military support that kept the Maduro government alive. Beijing and Moscow invested in Venezuela not out of solidarity, but out of strategic calculation. Venezuela was their foothold in the Western Hemisphere, their proof that the American sphere of influence had limits, their counter-argument to Washington's dominance in Latin America. That investment is now being erased, not through war, not through diplomacy between great powers, through a licensing document that Delcy Rodríguez's officials quietly accepted while the streets were full of flags and fireworks. The generals who maintained Venezuela's Russian arms agreements are gone. The financial channels that moved Chinese credit into PDVSA's operations are being closed. And the ideological framework, be the Bolivarian anti-imperialism that justified those partnerships for 2.5 decades, is being preserved purely as domestic theater, drained of any operational meaning. Beijing and Moscow are watching this happen in real time. They understand exactly what occurred on March 21st, and their response, whether economic, diplomatic, or through proxy channels, will shape the next chapter of this story in ways that no press release from Miraflores or the U.S. Treasury will ever accurately describe. What I am saying is that the timing of the trophy's arrival, the scheduling of the ceremony, the content of Rodríguez's speech, and the parallel execution of closed-door energy negotiations on the same day constitute a deliberate and sophisticated political operation. The joy was real. The use of that joy as cover was calculated. And the question that will define whether Venezuela's transition produces genuine democratic change or simply installs a new management team over the same authoritarian infrastructure is this: at what point do the people in those streets, the ones who genuinely loved their country and celebrated that trophy, look past the symbol in one hand and ask what is being signed with the other? The trophy is real. The speech was pure theater. The oil deal was the entire point. Everything else on March 21, 2026 was production design, carefully written, perfectly staged, and executed with the confidence of people who know that most of the audience will never read the contract.